Dating us with Conservative Home.
I'm just saying you're much bigger room, much better audience, you know, very impressive.
All the best people in this room, for sure. So obviously this is, and so introductions probably not terribly needed, but obviously I'm very pleased to welcome Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, and Iain Martin, who among many other titles is the Director of the London Defence Conference, as well as a columnist on the Times newspaper. So we'll talk amongst ourselves, and hopefully these two will talk amongst themselves, and I can just back out of the conversation, and then we'll hand it over to the audience about halfway through. So to start with, the obvious question, which I know you'll have been asked quite a few times, the war in Ukraine. Are the Ukrainians going to win, and when does that happen?
Yes, and I can't tell you when, but you know, I think they have everything on their side. They have right on their side, first of all. What's happening there, I was there last week, it's an absolute travesty to see a democratic neighbour invaded by basically a despotic, autocratic neighbour. But the reason why they are going to win is actually to do with where I'm next week and where I was 2 weeks ago, which is the Ukraine Contact Group, which is 50 countries, all of whom are supporting Ukraine, all of whom have skin in the game. The Ukrainian Contact Group, essentially of defence ministers and defence chiefs of staff, essentially, is a combination of countries in NATO, outside NATO. UK set it up and got it going. America leads it now. 50 countries have skin in the game, in other words, and they care about this, and they are on Ukraine's side. Ukraine will win this. Timing is much harder to predict, and I think it's quite possible in the end, or for some time, you might get to a position where, you know, a bit like other countries in the world, where they end up still having periodic flare-ups and conflicts, but can carry on building their own economy. So you think about somewhere like, you know, South Korea over the years, certainly Israel, countries which make themselves very successful nations. They modernize, they become high-tech, but they still have a neighbor or series of neighbors sometimes that are aggressive.
But I mean, to bring Iain on this as well, we were just talking about this before, and there is a sense that the war in Ukraine in the West has become sort of background noise. You know, we still have you still have the flag type in. It still sort of hits the headlines periodically, but people aren't thinking about it. People aren't focused on it. People aren't investing in it in the way that they used to be, and that cracks are showing up in the Western Alliance.
That's certainly that's the danger, and they are really starting to make progress. I mean, it's relatively small amounts, but you look at the operations that they've been running in the last few months, just now, maybe just in time with winter coming, there are really positive signs of progress. Of course, the thing that worries me most about it is the political risk, and the US particularly, because we're going into next year, well, if you thought 2022 was a crazy year in politics and 2023 is a bit calmer, 24 is going to be really quite intense. And you've got a US election in which you can see that the Republicans are shifting in a more isolationist direction now. So that's what really worries me. Of course, the relationship between the Pentagon and Congress is a kind of defining relationship, and as important as the relationship between the President and the Pentagon. But if the Republicans were to win and end up with a president who tweets something disobliging about Ukraine, or let's just end aid. Look at what's happening in Congress at the moment.
But there's one, I think it's a senator who is holding up hundreds of military appointments out of spite because he thinks that the army has gone too woke.
Yeah, so I think that is. I think the Secretary of State's absolutely right that the effort by allies has been extraordinary and has surprised a lot of people. If you'd predicted at the beginning of the war that allies would rally in the way that they have and spend and commit the resources that they have, there might have been some surprise, but it's held, and Britain has played a leading part in that. So I'm just flagging the political risk to come in the next 18 months.
Grant, a lot to go on there?
Yeah, look, I think it's always possible and always right to think about what is the worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario would be Putin winning the war. As I already said, I don't believe that will be the case. You know, Ukraine have not just right on their side, but 50 nations behind them as well. And they've also made tremendous progress. You know, I went to a Cobra on the 24th of February last year, and the overall view was, on balance, it was 72 hours before Putin's troops reached Kyiv. I was there twice this summer, as I see they're not there yet. And in fact, Ukraine have gained back half the territory now that Russia took. And yes, it's slow on the counter-offensive, that's certainly the case, but there are new fronts opening up, including in the last month what's happened in Crimea, which is that the Ukrainians have been fighting back there in a way that hasn't happened even including right back to 2014, when Putin first went in. So the shape of this war is changing, it's in a different phase. I think it's very possible to think about the worst possible scenario, which would be countries withdrawing their support, and there's a series of ways that you could get there with the US. I mean, in fairness, the US system is always pretty dysfunctional when it comes to things like its budget approvals process. So I wouldn't read too much into what happened last week or this weekend on that front. And even if Trump wins the nomination, and even if he's elected president, and even with what he's said so far, the one thing we do know about Trump is he really cares about China not being able to, for example, take military action in Taiwan. You know, there's a pretty obvious connection between the fact that China are looking very carefully at what happens by the use of power from Russia to draw conclusions about their ability to, you know, about the way they should behave in the world. So I think that it's right to think about these things, but there is absolutely nothing of certainty about any of them, and we just need to be prepared for all these possible outcomes. I can say a lot more about British leadership, but I'll wait for you to.
And the other area, of course, that you've just made an announcement on is Kosovo. So what's happening now? Why are British? I thought they, you know, Tony Blair Street. I thought it was all done and dusted.
Well, actually, we've had troops in the vicinity all along. And what I've announced yesterday actually is that we'll have a whole battalion. There are more troops that will therefore be leaving to join under NATO command. And the simple answer to your question is you've seen how things have been flaring up. It's been concerning this summer. We know that the Balkans can be a tinderbox with bad outcomes for the world, as we've seen in the past. We absolutely want to play our part in making sure we do not get to that stage. The British troops are the best of the best as when it comes to NATO deployment. I was asked by the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and I said yes. And in fact, I think I'm right to say, maybe the only, but one of the few, at least, countries who are part of every NATO deployment. So they would have expected us to say yes as well. And I trust that they will help to maintain the peace. We've seen a little lessening of tensions with Serbia moving some of their build-up back from the border, but we're watching very carefully.
So question for both of you. Obviously, it is becoming, it is an unstable world, and it seems to be becoming more so. Does the army, does the military have the resources that it needs and the manpower that it needs to meet its commitments and to keep the country safe?
I think the answer in the short term is yes. And you get into lots of interesting discussions on military spending. I've discovered there's no shortage of armchair and actual generals to advise on this. And the truth is that people will often have their particular preferred, you know, solution to whatever the problem. People will commonly say, if only you have another X tens of thousands of troops, for example, or if only you built this type of frigate.
Yeah. But it was striking that Boris Johnson was saying, you know, the days of tanks rolling across Europe are long past, and then, you know, smash cuts.
To that point, I mean, fortunately, we do still have tanks, and I just on Friday saw the Challenger 3. I mean, we've got new tanks coming, right? So it goes to my point, which is my view is you do want that balanced force. We're one of the few militaries in the world that invests heavily in each of the different 3 services, and plus some other areas, special forces and elsewhere. And I think it's important that we do. I don't buy that the solution is to put all our eggs in, for example, having a huge, I mean, choose whichever you want.
Flotilla of drones. Or,
or only soldiers, or because actually soldiers wouldn't have been useful in this conflict because we're not sending them. You know, so where would that have come in? So you've got to, I think we have to maintain in each area. And by the way, just to put this on record, with a military budget of over 50 billion, it's been about 53.5 billion, including assistance to Ukraine this past year. It's the largest in Europe, the second biggest in NATO. We still pack a punch, but part of that is the professionalism of our troops. So, you know, dare I suggest it, a battalion of our troops is not the same as sending a battalion of a lesser trained.
You can say Germany.
I was not going to say Germany, actually, but no, they are. They can be good. But not all battalions are created equal. And what we have with our military is a very, very, very high level of professionalism. So, I mean, I was talking to my American opposite number is that we know when the Brits arrive, you know, we can relax because these guys are always going to be very highly trained.
But another quick question for Iain as well, both of you. But isn't it not the case that the war in Ukraine has just very obviously shown up? I mean, lots of things about how you fight a modern war that we hadn't quite realised. Lots of things about how logistics, you know, how you can, just how quickly you can, like how much ammunition you have, how the use of drones, the use of. It is the most extraordinary sort of.
But the point you made about tanks illustrates it very well because the fashion has changed over the course of the last 18 months, and actually most of the recent evidence is back in that direction, back in the Boris direction. Just if you look at the numbers of tanks destroyed and how much easier it is now to destroy tanks, that could change thinking again. I mean, we're spending as a country about 2.3% of GDP with an aspiration to get to 2.5%. Now, I'm not just going to say that there's magically more money available. Obviously, there isn't. Times are really tough. But I think if about 2 to 2.5 was seen as okay before the invasion of Ukraine, then surely that's insufficient, considering the dramatic change that makes to the European security architecture. So I'm not saying that the money is available now, but if you look at the way that this is unfolding, other conflicts breaking out, that ripple effect that you get in war of other ethnic conflicts and old disputes flaring up again in a sort of classic European style, I just think we will be beyond 2.5 at some point in the next 2, 3, 4 years by necessity. If you look at what the Poles are doing, of course the Poles are coming from a long way behind in terms of spending, but they'll spend more than 4% of their GDP this year, nearly, could be even as high as 5%. They're also, it seems plausible, taking out an insurance policy on the Trump front. So Poland is cranking up its spending, and I think there's a realization certainly in Eastern Europe and in the Baltics and in Sweden and Finland, this is not a 2 or 3 year process. This is about the next 10, 20, 30 years. Even if Putin loses, as we hope he does, and he's replaced, there's no guarantee that you won't get another nationalist Russian leader, or you'll always be waiting for the possibility every morning of some kind of palace coup by the oligarchs, something we can't predict. So Europe will have to, the UK included, as one of the key powers in European defence, I think we'll have to be spending quite a bit more, actually. But as I say, if Jeremy Hunt was here, we'd say, well, that's simply implausible and there isn't the money. But sometimes when history unfolds, you have to find the resources.
On the same thing, I would say this, we are spending about 2.3%, which is true. If all of our European neighbours were doing the same thing, I haven't crunched the number yet, but it will be pretty big because, we are one of the few NATO countries that does above 2%, and now significantly above. And, we can't be the only protector of Europe. many of these countries are much closer, in fact, nearly all of them, are much closer to the threat. So, it stands to reason that they also need to pitch in. I think what Britain can do, the other point, a very obvious one, is not just about spending the money. As I said, you could spend the money and build a ground force of 1 million, or invest it all in tanks, or whatever. But what you need to do is make sure you're hitting the right actual weapons or actual production required, or actual techniques required, which goes way beyond what people normally think of. So, how intelligence operates is a big investment and not something that people immediately think of necessarily when they think of MOD spending, but is very significant in some theatres. So I think we have to play the part, which we've done by setting up this contact group, which is now, as I mentioned, become 50 countries. We orchestrated that. We play the part of bringing others in. We were the first to send NLAWs. We did it before. Ben Wallace very wisely did it before the war broke out. We were the first to commit and send tanks. We were the first to send long-range missiles. We've been the first at every single stage. I was the first to ban Russian aircraft from our airspace, the first to ban Russian ships from our ports, and then we got the Europeans to follow, we got America to follow. So I still see our role, not only having a strong and the biggest defence budget as we do, but also to be the convening power, to get others to do more and wake up. I'll just say this as well on defence spending. The thing that slightly worries me is, it costs money, particularly in a higher interest environment, to invest in defence equipment. And the thing which concerns me is when I see sort of activist investors saying it's somehow not ESG proof. I've been to Ukraine. The family who came and lived with me, family of 3 generations, the little boy was 6 when they turned up. They left because across the road from his nursery school, that apartment block was bombed out, and they said it wasn't their apartment block, but they looked at it and said, actually, we're not going to stay in Ukraine. When these fund managers are talking about ESG, they need to understand that by not providing facilities, by not investing, they are putting Nikita, this now 8-year-old, lives and many others at threat and forcing people to flee their homes. We must not allow that argument to win through. The moral thing is to invest.
It's a very good point, and it's a very live issue in the city and in the defence industry. But you're right, you ended up with a situation where it's quite difficult to quantify, a lot of it's subjective, but quite a few of those ESG wrappers, as they call them, on investments, treat defence as being similar to tobacco, just something which is, weapons are nasty, and don't invest in them. So it's not.
I literally want them to meet Nikita. Their position is immoral, in my view.
So it's not just about what government spends, but government, I think, could do could have convening power, encouraging the city to take this more seriously and seeing national security investment and investment in defence as, yes, of course, the city exists to make a profit, but that there's also another component to it as well, which is about national resilience and security. It's a live debate, which I think we'll hear a lot more about in the next 6 months or so.
I mean, I think we'd all agree on that, but there is a sense, just to push you on this, because what I was asking about originally was whether how Ukraine has sort of changed in terms of war. There is a sense that no matter if you give the MOD 5% of GDP, it will still absolutely not deliver bang for buck. It has, the MOD procurement process is absolutely notorious for being utterly awful, and in particular this phenomenon where costs are pushed back to meet the 5-year spending window, and designs are changed. The aircraft carriers, the overspend on that was extraordinary. So how are you going to actually ensure, whether it's 2%, 2.5%, or 3%, the money that's coming from all of our pockets is spent properly?
Well, look, I'm not from a military background, in common with all but 2 of the last 15 predecessors, as far as I can see. I'm a genuinely civilian politician in charge of the MOD. But what I have got is huge experience running very large, very complex, infrastructure-heavy departments. And I think I can see exactly what the problem is, which is if you are...
Although one of those departments was responsible for HS2.
Whilst I was there, we kept the thing on time. I appointed a minister. We watched it like a hawk. And of course, other things then intervened, including the war in Ukraine and coronavirus, both things which cost the country probably £500 billion between the 2 of them. So of course it's right to look at a HS2 or any other big infrastructure project. And I don't think we should be critical of the desire to be realistic about changes in our world around us and plough on with things just because it was once decided. The point I was going to make about big infrastructure projects, not that don't relate really to train lines which don't change at that kind of pace, but on military acquisition, if you think about, a submarine or an Ajax or some piece of kit, and it takes 10 years or 20 years to develop it, technology does just move along in a way, which it wouldn't with the train. It moves along in a way which is then tempting for the generals to sort of say, well, of course, that's now out of date. We've got to add this thing on. And usually adding that thing on adds to weight, and it makes the astute class not work, or the carrier, have to be redesigned, or the Ajax, be too heavy and rumble. And, So the biggest thing to do is set the criteria at the beginning, follow it, accept that the development cycle means that it will be the next refurb before it's updated to whatever the next thing is. There are ways of managing big infrastructure projects which I think will be far more effective, and we should also learn some of the lessons of the past. And as I see some of these projects which have been very troubled come through, the Ajax, for example, which I saw again on Friday, I think that's about to come out into a very good place. I was talking to personnel who've actually been training in them before the wider rollout. They are apparently superb. So I've had the good fortune to arrive in the post after some of the much talked about problems. We need to just make sure that we, with our future procurement, do not get trapped into that cycle of keeping going back and adding to the procurement requirements. That's one of the secrets.
You're also going to have a problem with the nuclear program, which, RUSI made this point recently very effectively in their report on the sort of spring, on the spring statement, financial statement, was that nuclear is consuming more and more, or a bigger chunk of the budget, and of that extra budget, which is clearly needed for defence, for all sorts of things. Nuclear eats up, I can't remember the precise figure, but I think it's the largest single amount. Obviously, the nuclear deterrent is important, and it's also added importance because it's connected to AUKUS. So you need that investment in capability, which is going to ensure that the UK can also help deliver that AUKUS programme, just pillar one. So there isn't a lot of, looking at the numbers this morning, there's not a lot of slack in there, and you've got really very little to play with.
Well, so first of all, the big macro point. I am, and we are, absolutely, completely committed to the round-the-clock nuclear deterrent, at sea, continuous, and we will never waver from that. Which, to make the political point, since we're at a Conservative Party conference, is in stark contrast to where the shadow cabinet is. The shadow foreign secretary has voted against Trident numerous times. I think there's even a shadow member of their defence team who's voted against. Sir Keir Starmer was in a cabinet that wanted to scrap Trident, or his leader wanted to scrap Trident. So, first of all, just on the national security stroke political point, I think it's very, very important in winning an election. What people really want is the security of knowing that the government intuitively understands that the nation's security is its number one and first priority, and I think we'll be able to be very reassuring on that front. I think it's very important as Conservatives that we remind people that is not necessarily the case with the opposition. Just on the narrower point, or though very important, about the next generation, this is where AUKUS is so important to us. And I announced yesterday in my speech £4 billion of contracts that we've just laid with work in Barrow and Furness, work in Derby. This is because AUKUS, remember, are nuclear-powered subs, not nuclear-firing subs. But the synergies are such that the ability of the training, a lot of producing this and a lot of cost is actually getting skills back to where they need to be over so many years of having had a break in manufacturing these kind of subs. So this is a very, very important program. Yeah, you're right. There's always going to be cost pressures, but myself, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor are absolutely clear that our #1 priority is the continuous at sea defence, and we will make sure that it's delivered effectively.
So we'll open this up to questions, but I've just got a lot more things I could cover, so I'll wrap them all together. Which is the bigger threat, China or AI?
Probably answering your question, because we're going to get upset. Look, I think AI is is a lot of things thrown into one. It's sort of, periodically you get a technology that comes along, and people will start to throw everything into the same bucket, but of course it can be lots of things. We're all using it every single day without realizing we're using it, because it runs the background of searches, or it helps to organize your inbox, or helps the traffic lights run. There are so many different ways it's being deployed. So it's like saying, is fire good or bad? It depends how you use fire. If you're using it to heat yourself, or if you're using it to, burn something down that shouldn't be burnt down. So it's a very difficult question to answer. And similarly, actually, on China, China's I don't know if anyone's read The World Order by Kissinger. Strongly recommend. And there's a book called The Long Game, which is actually all about China and their approach to their empire that they had and the empire that may come. And they play a very, very long game in terms of the way that they think about the world that the West often doesn't. I'm not critical of China because it would want to reshape a world around its own views. That is what every coming nation wants to do. What I do think is that there are some basic fundamental rights and freedoms which are universal, and that somehow we have to get compatibility between the two, and that we do that through the combination of being very aware, eyes open about China, and those who haven't read those books, and maybe you'll have recommendations for me, but I definitely start with those. Be interesting to see. But at the same time, also recognising they are a reality. They're involved in our supply chain. There are ways in which it would be best if they weren't. I took a decision, for example, against, you may remember something called Newport Wafer Fab, which is a decision over actually, weirdly, not fabricated chips at the time. They were already doing something else, but a Chinese ownership in Newport of chip manufacturing. And I personally took the decision to remove China ownership from that. So eyes wide open. But I'm not one of these people who at the same time as that says it's got China in front of it. It's bad. I don't think that's a good, sensible policy either. So we are always eyes wide open, but always trying to be constructive in our dealings.
Okay. So I'll open it up. Unless Iain wants to declare war on China.
Thank you very much. Jukka Siukosaari, Ambassador of Finland to London. Secretary, thank you very much for your contribution and talk. Finland, certainly as a new NATO ally, is very happy in the British contribution and interest in the security of Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea region, and especially our neighbour to the south, Estonia. In addition to the pounds and the dollars and the euros that we need for defence, there's also a need for the men and women who will use the equipment that we buy. How do you see the competitiveness of the British Defence Forces when it comes to recruitment in a situation where the whole society seems to be suffering from a lack of qualified labour?
Well, so, first of all, Your Excellency, welcome to our conference. It's a pleasure to have you here, and not just as a NATO member, but as a member of the Joint Expeditionary Force as well. So thank you. Very, very welcome to our conference. Actually, this question of personnel is partly a product of having very, very historically high levels of employment and very low unemployment. When I was growing up, many of us will remember the top #1 political issue at any one time was the high level of unemployment. It's incredible that we don't even talk about it anymore. And again, because we're a political audience primarily here, I just want to mention that every single Labour government in history of this country has left unemployment higher. And there's something else, in addition to our #1 core belief being in the defence of the realm, we should remind people that jobs are more plentiful under Conservatives. So that is my political message for the day. The issue of recruitment, which covers all spheres, including military spheres, is something, again, I've been spending quite a bit of time on. Last week I was visiting military personnel, asking them about their experience. How did they get involved? What brought them into the military? I think one of the best kept secrets for large numbers of people in the United Kingdom is that this could be an incredible career to progress. And because we don't have conscription and traditionally haven't outside wars, most people don't think first about, when they're thinking of their career, about a military career. But I was talking to, for example, one guy who told me he failed his exams. His description, I'll just repeat his words, was, I was brought up on a council estate, I failed all my exams, I was a dropout from school. He accidentally almost tripped into an army recruiter, and the end of his story, after much in between, was he had gone to, as a non-commissioned officer, gone to Sandhurst to do the training of officers, and it's completely changed this guy's life, completely. And at all sorts of other levels, engineers, electricians, mechanics, software, every area of expertise can be gained through military engagement. So I'm pretty convinced, actually, that most of our challenge is explaining to people the enormous array of opportunities available in the military. And I'm working on a campaign which would actually recruit for all 3 services who have traditionally recruited individually. So they actually have completely separate advertising campaigns, and bring it together to create more mass and bring more people in to military service. The last thing I was going to say is, when people are in our military, because it's a form of public service almost unlike any other, they are the best, most committed and most impressive people, amongst the most impressive people I've ever met as well. So people don't just get something out of it themselves, improving their own lives, but they sort of serve king and country, and you can see that coming through in the pride in their job as well.
Carol.
Thank you. Carol Walker from Times Radio. Can I take you back to the issue of international support for Ukraine? When you look at what has happened in the United States over the budget deal, the rhetoric we've had from Donald Trump, and you look at things like the row that Poland's engaged in over grain exports, a new populist leader in Slovakia, are you not concerned that the international support for Ukraine is at risk of splintering? And if I could just ask you also about this question of whether British troops will be sent to Ukraine to carry out their training mission there on Ukrainian soil. Is that a likely prospect?
Let me start with the second thing. The story was entirely erroneous. The Sunday Telegraph. Sunday Telegraph apologised and removed it from their front page. It wasn't supported by anything that had been said to them. I half wondered whether they'd mixed up the deployment of troops to Kosovo and somehow the lines had got twisted. I've met them face to face. The editor's comment was, let's move on. And thank you to Times Radio and the Times and other publications for not following it. It was an erroneous Saturday night a headline that was changed for the second edition. I think it may have come out of the need to train the trainers as well. We've now trained probably 50,000 Ukrainian troops, going back from before the main invasion. So going back to Crimea, which is an extraordinary effort, and it's an international effort. I went to see it at Salisbury Plain last week. We're now increasingly thinking about how we train the trainers so they themselves can go back and train others, and I think that may have been where confusion crept in, shall we say generously. On your first point, yes, I do worry about fragmentation. Of course, it'd be crazy not to. But I'm worried about different things throughout the conflict. From my very first day when I called Alexander Kubrakov, who was then my opposite number, is now Deputy Prime Minister in Ukraine. He was out in a field outside Kyiv because they thought that the capital would likely come under immediate attack. And from that day onwards, I've had a whole series of different worries about Ukraine and Ukraine's ability to win this war. Unfortunately, every single time so far, the world has come together in a way, as Iain said, that has defied expectations, and I very much hope that's what continues to happen. Look, as I mentioned before, the US budgetary process is a mystery unto itself. No other country runs its budgets in such a way, and I wouldn't read too much into the outcome of this particular settlement. There clearly is a particular strain there. There is what's happened in other countries and what's happened in Poland as well. And Poland has elections on the 15th of the month, and so there are domestic issues there. We're doing all we can to sort of reassure the Polish. In fact, I just sent yesterday some Typhoon jets to Poland in advance of that election, because I don't want Putin to feel that he can sort of rattle the boxes and cause concerns. So we're close to the Polish as well as the Ukrainians. I was in Poland last week. We're making sure that we provide them with the sense of security as much as possible. Through the contact group next week in Brussels, when I meet with NATO and the contact group ministers, I will be reiterating all of these points and bringing together ministers to reinforce the importance of us acting together. In the end, whether it's Poland or Britain or America or any other country, it is still surely, absolutely, in our medium and longer term advantage to make sure that Putin can't win, and particularly Poland, who are right next door to Ukraine. Right? So, that doesn't change. But I do agree we have to keep redoubling our efforts to shore up any gaps. I think we will.
Does Europe need a plan B? I mean, it's only a little more than a year until America goes to the polls. Trump could be back in office. If the worst happens, what does Europe do? And how is it organized? Is it organized via European NATO or Macron's new institution?
Well, so
how do you do it?
So I actually discussed this actual issue with President Zelensky last week. First of all, he doesn't actually think that the Americans under any scenario will walk away from this, and you can believe that or not. That's the central Ukrainian view, as I said before, because America will always be concerned about what happens in the Indo-Pacific. There's also good cause for thinking that you wouldn't want to inadvertently send the wrong message to Beijing. So that may or may not be true. And actually, regardless of whether that's true or not, as I said before, I do think it's very important that Europe steps up to the challenge of something happening not just on its doorstep, in Europe, right? In a country which is no further to fly to when you could fly there than going to a Greek holiday island or something. It's not some faraway, far-flung nation. And so, regardless of the US, it absolutely makes sense for me to work with our European counterparts and friends and neighbours and encourage them, as we've been doing all the way through this war, to double and redouble their efforts. You think about our response all the way through. We were the first to send long-range missiles with Storm Shadow, and the French sent their version, the Scalps, and the Italians say that they will, but we don't know when. The Germans, again, same. America's now coming. Every time we've been we're the orchestrating party. We do have the biggest defence budget in Europe. We are NATO's biggest supporter, provider in Europe. So I see our role as being pivotal in that, a leadership role in that regardless. But I think that role exists regardless of what may or may not happen, 3 or 4 turns of the wheel down the line in the United States.
Colvile.
Minister, we've got 2 aircraft carriers at the moment floating around the world without their full complement of aircraft. Isn't it rather signalling to any potential enemies that this is a bit of an empty solution? Can you confirm that we are going to have the full complement of F-35Bs in those aircraft to make them, to develop them to their full potential? They have no potential if they don't have the full complement of aircraft.
So the first thing which I've been well trained to say right up front is that we don't comment on the specifics of our deployment for very good and obvious reasons. But to give you a little bit more colour on that, first of all, it is wrong to look at numbers, for example, of aircraft, and F-35Bs are phenomenally more capable than aircrafts of the past. It's not just about numbers, it's about capabilities. Secondly, on missions like this, aircraft may or may not join elsewhere in the mission, and I don't want to go further on that side of things. Thirdly, aircraft carriers are about more than just carrying those aircraft, or indeed helicopters as well in the case of those 2 carriers, which, by the way, are second only in size to the US carriers. In France, China's carriers are not as capable and sizable. And that includes the other work that goes on in terms of the international cooperation. So I think I'm right in saying that on every single occasion they've deployed, and certainly now, we're working with international partners as part of a carrier group, and always inviting our global friends and allies in on that. So this is about much more than some aircrafts on top of carriers and travelling around the world. This is Britain projecting its power, but power with allies to have a presence in the world. So I actually think I actually think those aircraft carriers are proving their worth in the world, and I think that the F-35Bs do a phenomenal job in them.
We've got some flying past right now.
It sounds like it, yeah. Look, I can't comment more on the deployment, but I have looked at it, and yes, I am satisfied that the way that the deployment is going, without confirming or denying, as they say in military circles.
The lady at the back, why not?
Hi, thank you very much. I was just going to ask you about what you think with the developments in Azerbaijan and then Russia not acting. I just wanted your interpretation of what's going on and whether the UK might be involved.
I'm going to throw it to Iain first if you've got any views, otherwise I will.
I think, as I said earlier, it's a ripple effect, and leaders who may previously or before the invasion of Ukraine, who may not have made such a move, are now emboldened. I think there's an opportunity with NATO stretched, Russia stretched as well, to settle old scores. I hate to say it, but I think we're going to see a lot more of it. I have to say, I spent a couple of hours on Saturday morning reading about the conflict. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on it. It's intensely complicated. I can imagine any minister having to deal with it, and it's really, really difficult to follow. But I think it's a warning signal about our neighbourhood and near neighbourhood, and how much more dangerous it's going to get in the next 10 years.
Thanks. And the only thing I'd add to that, which I think is absolutely right, Foreign Office are sort of leading in that aspect. So, I'm always looking at, military involvement, engagement, but there's nothing really to add to the fact that we're living in a changing and I think potentially dangerous period. It could become a lot more dangerous still if there isn't the clear, win for Ukraine in this instance. I think it would unleash many other potential regional and international conflicts, which is why it's so important that we stick to the course with Ukraine.
It is also curious that it involved effectively ethnic cleansing, but that it hasn't really registered on the world stage in the way that you would expect. I think there's something coming at the United Nations, which will no doubt be ineffectual, but that's just to Rob's point about how we're getting used to this stuff. We're becoming slightly immune to these developments, but it seems to fit the description of ethnic cleansing.
So we have time for one more question, so it better be a fantastically good one, and I will trust my colleagues with the microphone to pick wisely.
Thank you very much. Just I want to ask a question about the coalition against ISIS, which is based in the eastern Euphrates. They supporting the Kurdish forces to fight ISIS. And now, what is the role of it? If it is still there, the forces, British forces still are in the area, but Turkey is a NATO member, and all the time they are attacking the Kurdish forces and even close to the coalition-based forces. They say they are terrorists. How they are terrorists and they are backed by the coalition, and why they don't have the decision, British, when Trump withdrew for Turkish to surrender for Turkish to invade the Kurdish area in 2019. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I don't want to disappoint you on that, but because my role is primarily on the MOD side, I think it's probably a question better focused to James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary. There is a little bit more I could say, but it's actually something I can't comment on directly here.
Is there not a sense that in your job, is there ever a feeling that it's like that you're sort of like a sort of schoolboy pushing sort of units around the map, or that's you were just saying, oh yes, I've just sent some jets to Poland to
The most frustrating thing actually, and it slightly goes to your question, but I cannot go further, is I will read things which I know to be factually untrue about, for example, our level of help or contributions, and have no way of correcting because we're often in an either confirm or deny stance for very good reasons, because British lives as well as others are at risk. And so I find myself being asked a question that I cannot directly answer, or reading information which I know to be factually incorrect and cannot redirect. So I think probably the answer is...
Well, in that case, so to end with a question you can answer, Iain, if you had one piece of advice for Grant, or one question you'd want to ask him, what would it be to bear in mind over that isn't on his radar that should be?
Sorry, I sound like a broken record, but just on the Europe question and what's potentially coming with the disruption in American politics, is just my advice would be try and get ahead of the game, and as I say, whether it's Macron's European political community, whether it's within NATO, obviously America's the central power, Jeff is very, very important, but I would be looking for as many ways as possible of ensuring that Europe can take a substantially bigger share of the burden on defending European security if the worst happens politically, which we've kind of learned in the last 10, 20 years that it makes sense to get to prepare for the worst and hope to be surprised on the upside. Thank you.
Well, with that, I'm really sorry, but thank you so much to Iain Martin, but thank you in particular to Grant Shapps. Please stick around for our next brilliant event, but in the meantime, please join me in thanking our speakers.